In video 5, we're going to continue our discussion of the uses of GDP. So, a very important use of GDP is as a measure of living standards. In current economic thought, greater production and greater consumption are assumed to be equated with greater living standards, right? So the more a country is producing, whatever is produced must be sold, so whatever is sold must be consumed, and hence the country that produces more goods is a country which has greater living standards. Of course, there's a problem here. If we were to compare Switzerland to the United States, just has greater GDP because it has a lot larger size in terms of population. So, just comparing the GDP of Switzerland to the GDP of the United States is a little naive. So, we need to control for population, and an important concept here is per capita GDP. Per capita GDP is GDP per person. And so the formula for per capita GDP is essentially GDP divided by the population of the country. This concept of per capita is pretty important. We use it not just for GDP and GNP, but for a lot of other economic and financial indicators. So this table here is a simple example which demonstrates, which country we would think would have a higher living standard. With China, which has a GDP of $9,000 billion, or Germany, which has a GDP of $3,700 billion. So just by looking at the GDP numbers, we would say China obviously has a higher living standard. The problem is China has a lot more people living in it, and of course sharing in the consumption of this much amount of GDP. And so once we divide by the population, we find that per person in Germany, average person is able to purchase products worth $46,000, while the average person in China is only able to consume products worth $7,000 or $6,800. Now, which country would you say has a higher living standard? I would say that Germany has a higher living standard for any person who's living there. The lower graph here shows you American real per capita GDP. And you can see that there's a first thing to observe is there's a strictly upward trend. So, if we believe that per capita GDP is a good measure of living standards, the living standard of the average American is definitely has gone up since 1965. Of course, we can see the effects of recessions. Whenever there's a recession, there's a sharp drop in per capita GDP, and this means that living standards fall during a economic contraction. And again, this motivates us to understand a graph like this. Why are there these short term fluctuations? Why are there contractions? Why are there expansions? And it's important to understand because now we can see that there are actual social effects of these economic contractions in terms of falling living standards. Um, the other thing that per capita GDP allows us to do is, again, basically to compare Switzerland and the US. It allows for international comparisons because we have controlled for two important factors. Number one, we have controlled for inflation. So when you see the phrase real GDP or you see the phrase in 1990 international dollars, essentially what we've done is we've held prices constant in 1990. So now when GDP moves, we know that it's moving because physical production quantities are changing, not that prices are changing. So the first control we have done here is controlling for inflation. The second control we've done is controlling for population. And so now all these lines of per capita GDP are fully comparable, and hence we can say that, say, Turkey has had a massive amount of increase in living standards since 1990. On the other hand, Nicaragua and Somalia have in fact seen lower living standards, and so on and so forth. The third and last important use of the measure of GDP is to basically calculate growth. We've kind of been implying it when we say the economy is healthier when GDP is expanding. Well, by how much is it expanding? We measure that by the concept of rate of growth. Now, again, rate of growth is a very basic concept. which is applied to, I'm sure you've applied it to things in your life. Essentially, the formula of a growth rate is final minus initial divided by initial times 100. And so, real GDP growth rate in 2015 is GDP in 2015 minus GDP in 2014 divided by GDP in 2014 times 100. And so for the United States, we can say that between 2014 and 2015, GDP expanded by 1.48%. These are actual numbers for American real GDP. Where did I get them from? I got them from um, um, I got them from this website, which is the St. Louis Fed website. So let's see if we can go to the St. Louis Fed website. Um, okay, it seems that I can't go right now, but I will upload a short video on how to navigate the St. Louis Fed website. Um, And so, what else? What else can we get away from this graph, from this slide? First of all, you have to know the formula for calculating the rate of growth. It could be the rate of growth of nominal GDP, the rate of growth of real GDP, the rate of growth of interest rate, the rate of growth of debt, rate of growth of investment. So you have to be able to apply the formula final value um, of the term that we're interested in minus the initial value divided by the initial value times 100. And the other interesting factor that comes about because of the relationship between real GDP and nominal GDP is that the rate of growth of nominal GDP is the rate of growth of real GDP plus the rate of growth of prices. And that's because nominal GDP includes changes in prices. We haven't corrected for them. And so we have to kind of, when we are talking about the rate of growth of nominal GDP, we have to factor in the fact that not only did quantities change, but also prices have changed over time. This graph here shows you how important the difference between real and nominal is. This shows you the level of U.S. Nominal and real GDP. The blue line is nominal GDP, which is really higher than real GDP, and it rises faster than real GDP. Well, yeah, because it includes changes in prices, and of course, we know things have been getting more expensive. The red line is the important one that shows you even without changes in prices of corn and cars and helicopters and Hummers, we see that GDP has been increasing, which means the physical quantities of Hummers and cars and corn has been going up.